we would be covering a very critical and important topic called FDA. And almost every medical device manufacturer or startup who plans to take their product global needs to go through this process if they're not opting for CE. So, to cover this topic, we have with us Mr. Uh, my voice not clear?
Aditi, your voice is just breaking up a bit.
Uh, okay.
I think it was good for a while. Yeah, it's better now.
Is it better now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Maybe I might be having some language issue. Anyway, without any further ado, uh, I would like to introduce you to Mr. Sheth and Mr. Sandra, who are the speakers for today's webinar. And this webinar could not have been possible without the support from Sateen sir. So Sateen sir has been helping out the startups who are incubated with us at SRH IIT Kanpur of various product compliances segment. Sateen sir could speak a couple of words on the initiative, and then I will actually introduce Mr. Sheikh and Mr. Sateen sir. Uh, Jatin, is my voice not clear? I'm seeing a couple of messages in the chat box.
Hi, Aji. We can hear you, but there is an echo from your side.
Okay. I'm not sure why that is happening because I'm not dialed in from multiple devices.
But I think it's better now. I think you can continue.
Okay. Satin, sir, are you around? Okay. Hello. Jatin, can you please give speaking rights to Satin, sir? Speaking rights, and also if you could enable his camera.
Speaking rights to whom?
I'm Satya. Okay.
Okay.
M. Satin.
Yeah. Just give me a second. I'm doing that. Just give me a second.
Thanks. Okay, while that is happening, a bit about the incubation center that we have in IIT Kanpur. So the incubation center is over 20 years, and we have supporting deep tech startups spread across all the domains, like health tech, life sciences, agriculture, cybersecurity. So ours is a sector agnostic incubation center, and this is one of our ways to provide guidance and right direction for startups to take the next step in their. So I can see certain sir.
So, should I talk now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I hope I am audible to all. Very good evening to all the participants, and very special thanks to Ajay, my friend, who has been coordinating. Though Aditi told a lot about me, I think the credit goes to Ajay, and of course, Bhavesh said very, very special thanks for being with us early morning at your time. And as all our friends here know, we are an innovative, kind of a country and people, very intelligent. But at the same time, we are also intelligent in manipulating things. So we have all these certifications coming left, right, and center. So this presentation specifically was meant to enable everyone with that knowledge. And more often, it is the startups who get into this kind of trap not knowing whom to choose, how to choose the right agency, and what exactly is the cost. So Aditi has done a wonderful thing to get all of you together. And with more such programs, I think the knowledge level would spread. So I'll not waste any time. Maybe in the end, if there is something, I'll speak. I think Aditi, let them start the program.
Sure. Thank you, sir. Uh, so for everyone, both our speakers are dialing in from the US, and that's why we scheduled it from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. IST. So now I would like to introduce Mr. Bhavik Sheth, who is a biomedical engineer with over 10 years of experience in medical development, research, testing, quality, and regulatory affairs. And he's been working with the Intech for over 12 years now as a senior consultant and has also served as consultant medical for 9 years. Mr. Ajay Sangla is also a senior consultant at Intertech for the past 3 years, and he is scientific assistant at Electronics Regional Test Laboratory. Okay, I think my voice is not clear. I don't know what's wrong with my bandwidth today. To keep it short, he's also had extensive experience as a biomedical engineer at Infosys Medical Corporation Limited. And with that, I would now welcome Mr. Sheikh and Mr. Sakla to please uh, present their presentation.
Thanks, Aditi. Hi, everyone. This is Bhavik Sheth. I'm currently located in Cleveland, Ohio. And as Aditi just mentioned, my background is in biomedical engineering. I'm originally from India, specifically Ahmedabad in Gujarat. And I did my undergrad in India in biomed and instrumentation engineering, and then came here for my master's in biomedical engineer. So when I started, I was basically more interested and geared towards medical instrumentation, research, and development of medical devices. Slowly, I got more involved into regulatory affairs, and my association with Intertech has been for over 13 years now, where my primary role has been as a lead regulatory consultant. Um, for a brief period, Intertech was also accredited by US FDA to perform medical device submission reviews on FDA's behalf. And I was a part of that program. So I've personally received training and interaction with FDA employees. And then eventually, Intertech decided to venture into consulting. So we had to pick one service over the other, but our client base was in more need of consulting services. Um, so today's webinar is basically to shed some light over the basic but more important and significant topics when you're dealing with FDA regulations for medical devices. And again, I greatly appreciate this opportunity. Thanks for the kind introduction by Satyen sir and Aditi, and thanks by Incubator Kanpur for giving us this opportunity. We're definitely looking to help out as much as possible from our end, and more importantly, um, talk specifically about the correct way of proceeding with commercialization of medical devices in the US. You may find some uncorroborated information elsewhere suggesting some alternate paths, but they are not always official. So again, the emphasis in today's presentation is to make sure that we are looking at the official guidelines and information as it appears on the FDA webpage. Um, you can obviously find a whole lot of information if anyone has tried going to the FDA website and looked at the medical device section. There's a lot of information. It could be overwhelming. So today we are going to cover some basics, as I mentioned earlier, but also look at some practical side of things on what are your very first steps when you're dealing with a medical device, you are planning to commercialize the device in the US, and how to go about the whole process. So just want to make sure my screen is visible. Aditi, can you confirm?
It is appearing.
Not yet. Not yet. Bhavesh.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Let me see. Should be available now. Um, okay. Are you able to see the screen now?
No.
No,
Okay.
not yet, Mr. Shiv.
Let me try again. May have to. How about now?
Yeah. Now it's there.
Okay. All right.
It's open.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. You can go to the full screen and start off.
All right. Okay. So, uh, just keeping it in this mode so I can bring up the web pages from the FDA website wherever we get into the practical side of things. Um, so basically, when it comes to US FDA, especially for folks in medical space, biomedical engineers, you always tend to think about medical devices, but the US Food and Drug Administration also regulates food, drugs, radiation emitting products, laser products, non medical lasers, vaccines, blood, biologic products, animal and veterinary products, cosmetics, as well as tobacco products. So it's quite a lot of regulatory oversight that the US FDA has. And depending on the role you find yourself in one or more industries, it's quite possible for selling the products in the US, you will cross paths with the US FDA. So today's focus again is on medical devices. So let's start with the definition of the medical device as it appears in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. It's basically an instrument, an apparatus, a machine, an implant, or any other related article, including a component, part, or accessory, which, if it performs one of these three functions in the bullet points and does not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action within or on the body, then it is categorized as a medical device. Uh, if we are looking at chemical action, then it gets into the category of drugs. So, just by looking at the definition, you can't always tell whether your device is a medical device. Sure, if you're looking at a ventilator, a blood pressure monitor, a CT scanner, or X-ray machine, it's quite easy to make a deduction that this is a medical device. It's being regulated as a medical device in the US. But you'd be surprised to find how many devices are regulated as medical devices by US FDA when you check the database. So while the definition is quite helpful, it can also be confusing and leave a gray area where there may be products for which you are not sure if the product is a medical device or not. So how do we navigate this process and basically come to a decision whether a product that we are looking at is a medical device or not? So we'll start with that aspect. But before I get into more about device classification, I just want to highlight the 5 most important steps for bringing a medical device in US, for marketing a medical device in US. Obviously, classification of the device is of utmost importance. You start there. Depending on the classification, you may be required to submit a pre-market notification, a regulatory submission to the FDA to gain permission to market the device. We'll look into that a bit later in the presentation. If required to submit a regulatory file, you need to make sure that you are reviewing the correct guidelines to prepare that pre-market submission. The next step is the formal submittal of the file to the FDA. And after the clearance is granted, after the approval is granted by the FDA, the medical device facility, the company selling the medical device in the US, needs to formally register and list that device on the FDA database. So, in a nutshell, these are the 5 most important steps that you'd basically be performing in order to bring the medical device into the US market. Preparation of pre-market submission also includes the step of performing the necessary testing. We'll get into that a little bit later. So we'll start with device classification. The US FDA categorizes medical devices into one of the 3 classes based on the degree of risk that they present and the regulatory controls that are necessary to provide a reasonable assurance to the patient, to the user, about safety and effectiveness. So we have a class 1 category, class 2, and class 3. Class 1 medical devices, as you'd assume, are the lowest risk devices, and only the general controls are applicable. For class 2 devices, we have products that tend to present moderate amount of risk. And for those kind of devices, general controls and special controls are applicable. And the last is the class 3, which is for the highest risk devices, life-supporting devices, life-sustaining devices, in which case general controls are applicable, but also a formal pre-market approval is required. Now we'll get into more detail about the actual submission types after finishing up the classification section. But in a nutshell, these are the main categories you're looking at. So how do we figure out whether first our device is a medical device, and secondly, what class it belongs to? In order to proceed to the classification and determine what kind of regulatory action you need to take, you need to first be also aware of general controls and special controls. The general controls are the regular guidelines that a medical device manufacturer has to follow and comply with, regardless of the classification, whether it's a class 1, 2, or 3 device. Basically, these controls impose the requirements against adulteration, misbranding, establish the requirements for formal registration and device listing, as I mentioned earlier. I mentioned a pre-market notification, a 510K submission. Some of you might have heard. This is one of the types of regulatory submissions which is most popular because it's kind of quicker than the other regulatory submissions made to the FDA. Quality system regulations, good manufacturing practices also fall into this category, unless, of course, if there is a class 1 device that is exempt from good manufacturing practice regulation. There are a few devices that are exempt from GMP, but not all of them. Most of the devices do require some or the other compliance with quality system regulations and good manufacturing practices. General labeling guidelines also fall under the category of general controls. And finally, medical device reporting. There is a lot of emphasis on reporting events, adverse events, and complaints related to medical devices. So those requirements are applicable regardless of the device class. Then we get into special controls. These are regulatory requirements that are mostly for class 2 devices because general controls alone are not sufficient to provide reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for class 2 device. So the special controls typically include performance standards, post-market surveillance activities, patient registries, special labeling requirements, pre-market data requirements, and lastly, the guidelines. FDA has published a number of device-specific guidance documents. If you go to the FDA website, you can find a guidance document on surgical masks, respirators, ventilators. You can find guidance documents on CT scanners, MRI machines. So although there isn't a guidance document available for every medical device type, There are many that are available, especially when you're dealing with special controls. So you'll find in the slides here, I've tried to include, where possible, specific web links to the FDA web pages where you can directly go and find more details about these topics. So those are the direct links to the official source. So with so many medical devices, FDA basically have classified, uh, based on the regulatory description, all of the medical devices into a formal code of federal regulations under 21 CFR parts 862 through 892. What this means is when you look at the device classification database, which we'll do in a few minutes, you will find that there is always a 21 CFR number associated with it. You can go to that regulation and find more descriptive details about the device type and the specific limitations imposed under that regulation. In total, FDA has classified and described over 1,700 distinct types of devices, and these are all organized in specific medical specialty panels. So I've indicated all the panels here. You're looking at anesthesiology, cardiovascular, chemistry, dental, ENT, gastroenterology, urology, general and plastic surgery, general hospital category, hematology, immunology, microbiology, neurology, obstetrical and gynecological, ophthalmic, orthopedic, pathology, physical medicine, radiology, and toxicology. So you have, I believe, 19 medical device specialty panels. Again, this is one way of trying to find the classification of the device. If you know that the type of product you have is a cardiovascular product, you can directly go to this cardiovascular specialty panel regulation, part 870, and check all the cardiovascular devices that are basically categorized by FDA. If you're looking at a catheter, for example, you'll find a lot of different types of catheter mentioned under the cardiovascular panel. Now you have to then figure out which type of catheter you have and which one you're going to bring to the US market. So that is one way of finding device classification, but there is other easier way, which is through the device classification database. So this is FDA's formal device classification database, and the information you find here supersedes anything else any regulatory consultant will tell you. If there is a conflict in the message you are getting regarding classification, what you find on the FDA website is the final decision by the regulatory authority. If a device, if you have a device that is novel and for which a classification doesn't exist, then yes, there are ways in which inquiries can be made to the FDA. I'll cover a bit on that later, where you can ask FDA, basically explain FDA about your product and ask them to provide insight into the classification and the regulatory requirements. But this is the FDA device classification database page. If you notice on the right side, there are other databases as well. There's a database for 510Ks. I know from Aditi there's a lot of interest in trying to find out or best practices or some best actions to determine a predicate device when you're doing a 510K submission. So we'll look a little bit into that as well. But there are other databases as well, and depending on uh, what kind of action you're taking, whether you are already selling the device in the US and trying to upgrade the product or trying to find information about different types of devices, you can use one or more of those databases. So coming to the device classification database, you see the first field there is for device. So it's called device type. If you type a ventilator just a common term, you'll end up seeing all the classifications associated for a ventilator type product. Similarly, if you type uh, catheter, you can get a list of specific classifications available for catheter device. That's one option. Uh, if you don't always find success with that, you can try the review panel, the specialty panel, as I mentioned earlier. There's a drop down menu on the review panel. Um, if you know the product code, based on your research of competitive devices in the market, in the US market specifically, then you can put a 3-letter product code to figure out the classification or ascertain the classification. Or if you know the regulation number, as I mentioned earlier, the 21 CFR number, you can try that as well. So these are some of the options you have in trying to find out the correct device classification. So I've selected an example here for a surgical mask. When I go to the uh, product classification database and I type in surgical mask, um, I end up with this classification. Now, I want to spend a little more time about this on this page, explaining what all information you can find when you look up the classification. So the first item there, first piece of information you're looking at is a device common name, which is surgical mask. Then there is a regulatory description, which is surgical apparel. So the surgical mask is basically belongs to a category called surgical apparel. And if you look at the regulation number 878.4040, that's 21 CFR 878.4040. That regulation number is tied to this regulation description, surgical apparel. If you search by this number alone, you will find all other devices that are currently being regulated under the category of surgical apparel. So you will find surgical gowns as well. You'll find other PPE type products as well. So that's why I mentioned earlier, there are different ways in which you can try to find out device classification. Then we have regulation medical specialty. So this type of product falls under the general and plastic surgery division, specialty panel. And the review panel will be the general hospital. The product code, 3-letter product code is FXX. And then another important piece of information is submission type. So how do you know what kind of submission you need to make? Actually, before that, you can check the device class. As it appears here, this product is a class 2 device. Now, knowing that the product is class 2 is fine, but how do you know what kind of submission you need to make or you don't need to make to the FDA? For that, you check the submission type. And it says here 510K, so it means you need to submit a 510K submission to FDA before placing this type of product in the US market. Basically gain FDA's clearance to commercialize this type of product in US. If you see 510K exempt here, it means the product is exempt from 510K, and in that case, a submission doesn't need to be made. If you see a PMA here, that basically means the product requires pre-market approval, which is a more stringent submission compared to the 510K. We'll talk about that a bit later. The next key piece of information is about GMP exemption. As it says here, there is no exemption, which means manufacturers of surgical masks will need to comply with good manufacturing practices, basically the quality system regulations. And the applicable standard for quality systems, medical device quality management systems, is ISO 13485. So this is some key information you can find right away from the device classification page. Now you see a lot of recognized standards. So these are some standards that FDA tend to indicate on the classification page itself. My take on this is that this list is never absolute. you cannot solely rely on this list. Uh, and I'll give you an example for this. If you look up a ventilator product code and you look at a similar classification page, you will see some standards mentioned, but you're never going to find the basics general electrical safety standard, which is IEC 60601-1, or the general EMC standard, which is IEC 60601-1-2. Now, does that mean that you don't need to comply with that standard? Absolutely not. So that's why use the information on this page about the standards uh, as a guideline rather than an absolute complete list of requirements you need to meet. Um, you need to do your due diligence when you are submitting a 510K to FDA by comparing your product, your proposed device against a predicate device and checking the predicate details that are available on the FDA website. A lot of times that tells you what standards need to be complied with, what kind of testing is needed to satisfy FDA requirements. Nonetheless, you will find some recognized standards mentioned by FDA. More often than not, these are all special controls, basically specific performance related standards rather than general standards that are mentioned. So what else can you find in the device classification database or using a device classification database? If you go to the 878 4040 link, basically the regulation number hyperlink, and click on that, you are going to find a description of the device category that is covered under this regulation. So I'll zoom it a bit. Uh, Hopefully this will be visible. So we're looking at a surgical apparel. There is identification of what a surgical apparel means. Can I include surgical caps, hoods, masks, gowns, operating room, PPE products, a whole lot of other products, and the classification type. So you can find a good amount of description of what the product limitations are using this approach of first checking the FDA classification, then going to the regulation number and finding the exact description. That tells you and gives you more confidence on the classification of your medical device. So, just to sum up the significance of device classification, the class to which the device is assigned will determine, among other things, the type of pre-market submission that you need to make to the FDA. So, if you have a device that is class 1 or 2, and if it is not exempt from regulatory submissions, then mostly a 510K will be required in order to sell the product in the US. If the product is class 1, or in very select situations, class 2 product with 510K exemption, then there are no regulatory submissions needed. However, just be aware that regardless of all the device classifications, class 1, 2, 3, whether or not a regulatory submission is needed, if you have a medical device, if you have a product that is considered a medical device by FDA, you have to list and register that device with the FDA, and you have to maintain your registration on an annual basis. The devices that are exempt from pre-market submissions are also identified in the 21 CFR, but I think the device classification page is a better approach to confirm what class the product falls under and what kind of regulatory submission will be applicable. Lastly, for class 3 devices, a pre-market approval application is almost always needed, and this application requires or has a heavy reliance on clinical data. So that's the most stringent type of application. What if you have a product for which you can't find the device classification, or for which FDA hasn't established a category at all. For that kind of situation, you have an option to reach out to FDA by submitting a formal inquiry, which is also referred to as 513G, where you are requesting information from FDA. So it's a formal request where you provide FDA details about your device and get FDA's written feedback about the classification and what kind of regulatory submission requirements will be applicable. You don't always need to submit this inquiry. If you know your classification from the uh, device classification database, or knowing a product that a competitor is selling and that your product is very similar, um, that's often enough to confirm the classification. But when you are dealing with a device for which you can find no information on the FDA device classification database, then and you want to get clarification or confirmation regarding your approach and the correct classification, then it's good to submit a 513G. If you are unsure about the regulatory submission type, again, you can submit a 513G request to FDA. Or if you are ending up in a situation where you can find the device classification category, but you are not able to find predicate devices, then again, you can submit this inquiry to FDA for more clarification. So just be mindful of when you are choosing this option, because FDA's response is not going to be quick for these inquiries. In fact, their official timeline for response is 60 days. So basically 2-month time period. Doesn't mean that they'll take all of those 60 days. They could respond in a month or 45 days, but the official timeline is 60 days. So once you've classified your device, you choose and prepare your correct pre-market submission. So now we have to consider what all different types of submissions are possible, pre-market submissions in particular. So here we have 4 main types of pre-market submissions. The first one is 510K, which is also called a pre-market notification. The second one you see there is a pre-market approval. The third one is a Denovo, where it says evaluation of automatic class 3 designation, but I'll explain a little more about that category. And the last one is a humanitarian device exemption. So these are the 4 main types of pre-market submissions that could be made to the FDA depending on the device classification. We'll talk first about the 510K, and we'll spend a little more time on this topic because there's a good amount of interest in knowing how to find predicate devices. So I'll show some examples. As I mentioned earlier, some class 1 and most class 2 devices will require a 510K. In a 510K submission, it's not sufficient just to show the safety and effectiveness of your product. Basically, if you present your test data and compelling evidence that your product is safe and effective, that alone is not sufficient. You need to demonstrate that your device is also substantially equivalent to a predicate device in terms of its intended use, technological characteristics, and performance aspects. Now, the term substantial equivalence, let me explain that a little more. Doesn't mean that you have to claim superiority over the product that's already in the market. Substantial equivalence means that you are demonstrating to FDA that your product is at least as safe and as effective as the predicate device. Now, a predicate device, just to be clear, is a legally marketed device in the US that has received 510K clearance from the FDA, and you can confirm it in the FDA's 510K database. You cannot choose a predicate device from any other market other than the US, meaning if the device is not sold in the US but it is sold in EU, in Europe, or in Asia, you cannot submit a 510K claiming substantial equivalence to that product. You have to select a product that is legally sold in the United States and under the same classification category. So the predicate device identification becomes very important when you need to submit a 510K. Also, as I mentioned earlier, some class 1 and class 2 devices you will find are exempt from 510K. If you are in that situation, then you don't need to do a 510K. So coming to the predicate device selection criteria, what are the most important factors to look at? First is to confirm the same device classification. If you have different device classifications, meaning that your device is classified in a different category compared to the predicate you are citing, then you'll have questions from FDA. More often than not, that's not allowed. You need to have, for the subject device, you need to have the same intended use as the predicate device that you are citing. Here, you got to be careful in figuring out what your intended use is versus what the indications for use is. So, taking the example of surgical mask, you have surgical masks that are basically intended for protection of the patient. And if the intended use is limited at that, then yes, you have the same intended use as a surgical mask that is sold in the market, in the US market. But you could have slightly different wording in the claims, in the indications for use. That's permissible, although those indications should not be so different that then FDA begins to question the safety and effectiveness and the whole substantial equivalence argument. So the way I would put it is, the intended use should be the same, but the indications for use should be comparable. And lastly, the technological characteristics. Depending on the type of product you're looking at, if it's a medical electrical product involving software, wireless capabilities, or if it's a non-electrical device, you could be looking at different attributes from a technological characteristic standpoint and the specifications. But the bottom line is, you will have to be able to you'll have to show to the FDA, to demonstrate to the FDA through a thorough comparison that if there is a difference in some specification or technological characteristic, that there is supporting data based on testing or a scientific rationale uh, to demonstrate that such a difference won't lead to new concerns of safety and effectiveness. So that's the main aspect of the whole 510K submission. So we'll look a little bit now into finding the predicate devices. I showed earlier the device classification database. This is another database, which is called a 510K database. We'll again take the example of the surgical mask. If you recall, the product classification code was FXX. So one of the options you have is, in trying to find a predicate device, is to put the product code, and that way you see all the surgical masks that are currently cleared and being sold in the US market. That's one option. If you know the manufacturer's name, if you know the name of the manufacturer who's selling a surgical mask and you want to use that as a predicate device, you can simply put the applicant name and leave other fields empty. If you know the trade name of the product for which you're trying to find the 510K number, you can put that as well. So these are some of the ways in which you can find the 510K information or information about predicate devices. And lastly, if you know the 510K number, then it's very easy. Then you just put the number and find it. So again, various ways in which you can use this database to find the information. But what kind of information are you going to get there? So going by that example for the surgical mask, I put, this is basically the search result I got when I entered FXX as a product code. So as you can see, I got a total of 425 results, meaning I have more than 400 products to choose from as a predicate device if I want to use one of these products as a predicate to compare to a surgical mask that I'm trying to bring into the US market. And what you see in this list is the trade name of the device or the product, the applicant who submitted the 510K, the 510K number, and the date the 510K was granted clearance. So this is how you do a predicate device search. Now, you're not going to get much beyond the product name through this page alone. So if you select one of these products, you'll find more information about that predicate device. You'll find the 510K number, of course, the device name, the applicant information, but now you also find the applicant's registered business address. So you know what region that manufacturer is based, and from where they are selling the product in the US. You also find information that you typically find in the device classification database. You find the regulation number, you find the product classification code, approximate timeline when the 510K was received and the decision was made. Most importantly, you can find a 510K summary. Now, sometimes you'll only find a statement here. A statement doesn't give you much except the intended use, but a 510K summary gives you more details. So a lot of times we are asked the question by our clients, how can they find more information about a predicate device? Or how can they find official information about the predicate device rather than relying on just the predicate's manufacturer's website? So this is one option. You can go to the FDA webpage, the 510K classification database, find the predicate device, and look for details in the 510K summary. The next type of submission is pre-market approval. And as I mentioned earlier, most Class 3 devices will require pre-market approval. This is the most stringent type of pre-market submission, almost always requires clinical data. And before a PMA is approved, the applicant will need to provide valid scientific evidence demonstrating adequate data to support the intended use. So you are not looking at predicate device comparison in a PMA. A pre-market approval is solely for the product itself. Think about implants and other high-risk devices. Those fall under the category of a pre-market approval submission. And for those, you need to provide adequate data and almost always clinical data. So this submission takes longer as well. The other type of submission that I mentioned earlier is Denovo. What if you end up having a new device, but that doesn't have a valid predicate, or if it doesn't fit any classification? As I mentioned earlier, you can reach out to FDA through the 513G inquiry, and FDA may come back and say, well, we don't have any product classification for this device type that you have, and you'll need to do a de novo for this. Well, de novo is a regulatory submission as well, and it's specifically for novel devices. If you are required to submit a de novo application, it's best to start with a pre-submission to the FDA. I'll talk a little bit about the pre-submission in a couple of slides. Eventually, you're going to provide the same amount of information, in fact, a little more than what you provide in a 510K. Of course, you're not comparing against the predicate, but you're still providing test data, device design documents, software documents if applicable, material information. So all the attributes that are applicable for the device, you have to provide supporting information to the FDA. and then they review the de novo and grant classification and grant the clearance. Now, once a de novo is cleared, automatically a classification category is created. So think of this in a scenario where company A submits a de novo. So they didn't have a classification for the product type. FDA made them do a de novo, and now that product is in the market. The de novo has been approved. Company B later decides to market similar device, but now they can use company A's device as a predicate device. So now they don't need to do, company B doesn't need to do a de novo. They can simply do a 510K because now a classification exists and now at least one predicate device exists in the US market. So that's how the de novo approach works. And lastly, we have humanitarian device exemption. This is a specific category, very stringent requirements by FDA for having devices categorized in this category, in this classification, and being able to do a submission. In order to complete a humanitarian device exemption submission, the applicant needs to first obtain a formal written designation of their product being a humanitarian use device. And this is done through FDA's specific division, which is called Office of Orphan Products Development. So when discussing de novo, I had mentioned about pre-submission. This is another type of inquiry process, which is also called a Q submission program. So you can use this pre-submission approach before submitting a 510K, before submitting a de novo, before submitting a pre-market approval. The benefit is that you can actually share information with FDA about the type of testing you are planning to do and ask FDA very specific questions, whether that testing is adequate, whether you are missing anything, just to get more confidence for your regulatory submission. The downside is that FDA takes over 2 months to review the pre-submission. So my general recommendation in planning for a regulatory submission is to always leave some buffer as far as time frame is concerned for doing a pre-submission, because once you get a written feedback from FDA about how you're going to do the submission, and if they give their blessings, more often than not, you're not going to get very critical findings upon review of your regulatory file. So for that reason, the pre-submission is very important. So you can request a formal written feedback, and you can also request a meeting with FDA reviewers to discuss the feedback. So this is an opportunity for an applicant, for a submitter to obtain feedback prior to a full pre-market submission, prior to spending a lot of time and money in testing the device. Get a peace of mind, get more surety about the budget you're going to operate under to complete the regulatory filing. And it's entirely voluntary on the part of the submitter. So it's more for the convenience of the submitter rather than a regulatory requirement. Once the submission is compiled, once the submission is chosen and compiled, next step is to formally submit to the FDA. So for that, specific fees are allotted, are basically declared by FDA every fiscal year. I'll bring up the chart, the user fee chart for this year, where you pay the user fee for a submission, depending on the submission type. Electronic copy of the submission needs to be submitted to the FDA. Normally, FDA will start with administrative filing review, which is also called screening, in which FDA conducts a superficial and overview just to assess whether your submission contains adequate information. If the submission doesn't contain adequate information, then the file could be put on hold. and you could get a letter stating that your submission doesn't contain adequate information for a substantiative review. But let's say your submission is complete enough. Uh, the FDA reviewer will start a formal review, a substantiative review, and there will be interaction during the review where FDA reviewers can ask questions and give you time to respond to the questions. So that's the process of submitting the file to the FDA and what you can expect in terms of interaction with FDA. After you get your 510K clearance or pre-market approval, or whether you have a class 1 device that is exempt from all these requirements, you still need to complete your medical device registration, medical device listing and medical business registration with the FDA. So in terms of completing this process, you're basically required to fill out an online form where you basically have to provide information about your business, uh, the type of devices that you are marketing in the US, and basically sharing some confidential information about your company. This information doesn't become available on the FDA webpage, so it's not in the public domain. The only information that goes in the public domain is your medical business name, address, and your establishment registration number. Any other confidential financial information doesn't get published. So next, I just wanted to show the chart, the user fee chart for fiscal year 2022. Don't have it here, but if you go to this FDA webpage, you will see that this fees are applicable for a period starting from October 1st of 2021 through September 30th of 2022. Every year, the fees increase a bit. So you have to check uh, this chart every year to make sure you're aware about the correct amount. But looking at this chart, you can see the application types mentioned in the first column, which tells you if you're doing a 510K, then your standard fee is $12,000, over $12,000 for the 510K submission. This is the fee that is charged directly by the FDA. This does not include any regulatory consulting costs, any testing costs. It's simply the fee that the FDA is charging for reviewing your file. Now you notice here the last column for small business. So the small business fee, as you can see, are less compared to the standard fee, are substantially less compared to the standard fee. And FDA defines a small business as a business, including its affiliates, whose gross receipts and sales are less than $100 million for the most recent tax year. So a lot of companies, definitely all the startups, would be eligible to apply for a small business. But it's again a formal process where you have to share your financial documents, your tax returns, to demonstrate to FDA that you're indeed a small business. And you get a small business designation number in return, which you need to indicate on your regulatory submission filing in order to get the benefit of the reduced fee. So that's the fee structure, as you can see. I mentioned 510K submission is popular and most sought after mode of application. That's because Denovo is a more time consuming and stringent submission. PMA is the most time consuming and stringent submission, but their cost is also substantially higher compared to the 510K, as you can see here, where you're looking at over $12,000 as a standard fee. You're looking at Denovo, almost 100K more. And when you go to PMA, you're looking at over $350,000. So be very mindful of these fees that the FDA is charging. Now, talking about the fees and what you find with regulatory consultants, So I'll give you an example about Intertech first, how we charge for our consulting and what kind of flexibility we have. And that doesn't mean that all the consultants out there in the market are going to be doing the same thing. They might be having a different way of uh, providing the service and charging for it. So, particularly for Intertech, our consulting, our regulatory consulting is flexible in that you could prepare your own file and then have Intertech review the file and do a gap analysis and provide suggestions for remediation and corrective actions. That's one approach. Takes less time compared to the other option where our clients come to us to basically prepare the entire 510K. So you see right there the amount of consulting time that we spend significantly differs, and that changes the cost that we charge. The other important factor is the device type. For a surgical mask, for example, if we are charging, let's say, 50 hours of consulting time to prepare a 510K, uh, and if I am looking at another type of device, which is a steam sterilizer or ethylene oxide sterilizer, which is an electrical product with software and a whole lot of sterility information validation, uh, the average consulting time for that kind of submission preparation would be around 120 hours. And we have our hourly consulting rate. So when you put the two together, you can see that could be quite a big range of consulting cost. Now, you also need to be mindful of the testing cost. Uh, Many of you might be aware that Intertech does a lot of electrical safety, EMC testing, a whole lot of other performance testing for medical devices. But there are several tests that Intertech currently doesn't perform. Biocompatibility, animal testing, clinical testing. Most of these tests are not performed by Intertech. Uh, a lot of sterilization validation is also not done by Intertech. And when you go to external labs for that, uh, you want to make sure that you have a properly accredited lab that you are reaching out to. And more often than not, you should be looking for ISO 17025, the general accreditation for labs good practices. Uh, your lab should be at least accredited to that standard. Um, and you can shop around. I always you know recommend our clients to shop around with the testing cost, because you could find some testing that's done um, quicker and cheaper in Asia compared to something that you want to get tested in Europe. That always happens. And as long as you are choosing an accredited lab, a competent lab, there is no problem in doing the testing outside the US. Most of the tests are anyhow done to internationally recognized and harmonized standards. So the only thing that you need to also ensure is, and this is again going back to Intertech's example, if we do electrical safety EMC testing for a client and FDA has a question on the test report, we stand behind our clients and support them with rationales and justification. So the lab you choose, make sure you have that kind of an arrangement with them, that kind of an agreement with them, that should regulatory agencies raise any questions on the use of the standard, interpretation of the standard, any deviations made in testing, that the lab will support you in answering those questions. So those are my main tips when it comes to uh, figuring out, you know, the approach for pursuing regulatory consulting for your regulatory filing, and be mindful of the FDA fees, be mindful of the testing cost, and be mindful of the regulatory consulting costs. If I have to put it simply, the especially for the 510K, FDA's review fees are going to be less compared to regulatory consulting fees. And regulatory consulting fees are going to be less compared to the actual testing cost that you will incur in trying to bring your product into US market. So with that, covered all the main topics that I wanted to in today's presentation, and I hope that this overview sheds some light on the important steps in commercializing your medical device in the US market. Also, relying heavily on the information that you find on the FDA webpage. If you are working with a regulatory consultant, sure, this consultant can help you identify the requirements, but it doesn't hurt to go to the FDA website and just corroborate the information. And the links that I've shared in this presentation will help you do that. So with that, Aditi, I'll hand over um, the presentation to you now.
Thank you, Mr. Sheth, and it was indeed quite insightful presentation, especially the way you walked us through the portal of US FDA and 510K. I really hope that in coming future, our regulatory body, CDSCO, can also come up with such a helpful portal so that these startups and the manufacturers, we don't have to go through those intensive documents and then identify the correct category and identify the right product compliance certificate applicable. So, Mr. Sheth, we have quite a few questions in the chat box. Uh, yeah. So, Mr. Srinivasan wants to know for Q submission, what will be the minimum documentation required by FDA?
Okay, that's a good question. So, for the Q submission, you can submit as less you want and as more as you want to the FDA. It's in your best interest to submit as much information as you can. And I'll give you an example. Let's say you are planning to do a 510K. You've done your due diligence and found out the predicate device. You know the classification, the type of tests that need to be done, but you're doing a Q submission just for your peace of mind. If you tell FDA about your device and just ask the regular questions, okay, what's my classification? Am I selecting the correct classification? Am I doing the correct regulatory submission? You will get those answers from FDA. But if you provide FDA a list of the tests that you are planning to do, if you provide FDA the protocols for the testing, FDA can review it beforehand and tell you if you've covered everything or if there are any gaps. Especially if you are doing, let's say, any performance testing without not based on any particular standard, or doing animal testing for which sample sizes are not always set in stone. If you select a smaller sample size, then all your cost and time spent on doing that testing um, will be null and void if FDA comes back and tells you that it's not enough. So the other thing I recommend for Q subs is to provide information about the device functionality as much as possible, and if possible, provide a user guide as well, because that tells FDA what your product is, if the product includes software, what kind of software it is. So the more you provide to the FDA, the better. At a minimum, FDA wants to know indications for use, the device description, and the draft labeling. I think those are the important elements for the Q sub. What I'm going to do, Aditi, there are a few other links. I believe at least 3 or 4 links that I haven't put in this presentation. I will send those to you. One of those links is for, actually, I think I have included the link on the Q sub. So if I go back to the presentation, all right, so this is the link where you'll find more information about the Q submission program, but there is a detailed guidance. There's a detailed guidance with table of contents on how to structure the entire Q sub, depending on the application type.
Cool. Should I move on to the next question, Mr. Sheth?
Yeah, sure. I've got about 10 minutes before my next meeting starts, so let's take
Oh,
as many
yes, yes,
questions.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, sure, sure. Where to get an online submission form? FDA register any URL. This is by from Mr. Arun Kumar.
Yes, there is a link on the FDA website where they've given all the forms, including the 510K forms and any other forms. Now, bear in mind that any of these submissions that you decide to make, there is a detailed guidance provided by FDA on how to prepare a 510K, how to prepare a Denovo. And when you read those guidance documents, you'll find references to some specific forms. Uh, and those forms are provided on the FDA website. So these are the 3 or 4 URLs that I was talking about, Aditi, that I'll send you in an email, and
Cool.
you can pass it on to everyone. Yeah.
Sure, I'll certainly do that. Another last question. One more question is, apart from 510K, what else is required to place a radiotherapy device in the US market?
Well, so radiotherapy device. First of all, I'll go back to the classification. Um, Check the classification and confirm that it is indeed a 510K that is required. And let's say you've confirmed that yes, the 510K is required. Now, once you've done the 510K, bear in mind that you still need to register the product with the FDA. Compared to the 510K, the registration process is very simple. You're just giving your company information and device name and trade name, and basically maintaining the registration on an annual basis. So that's one more thing that is required. But one thing that manufacturers often tend to overlook, and that kind of hits them hard at the back end, is quality management system compliance. So radiotherapy devices, class 2 devices, you have to comply with ISO 13485, medical device QMS. FDA doesn't ask for quality management system documents in 510Ks, but once the 510K is cleared, FDA can perform an audit anytime. They do random audits. So they visit the sites unannounced, and they can ask you for proving compliance with quality management system and any other good manufacturing practices evidence. So those are the additional things I would recommend keeping in mind just beyond the 510K.
One final question for the day. So, if the device is exempted from 510K, how much will it cost to register?
Okay, well, that's easy to answer. If the device is exempt from 510K, you're not going to pay any of these fees. All you're going to pay is the annual establishment registration fee of $5,672 just for this year. Next year, it will increase a bit. Uh, but bear in mind that if the device is exempt from 510K, it doesn't automatically mean that the device is also exempted from GMP. So your cost with FDA, of course, is limited to this amount on an annual basis. But what you need to do as a manufacturer to implement your quality management system, that's something you will have to budget separately. But yes, you're spending only this amount with the FDA.
Okay, with this, we come to the end of the session. Thank you so much, Mr. Sheth, and thank you so much, Mr. Sankla, for the wonderful presentation, especially Ajay sir for taking up the questions in the chat box while Mr. Sheth was presenting. It was indeed a very, very knowledgeable and insightful session. We do have a couple of questions in the chat box, but I would request the audience to please write your queries to us. You must have received an email from Bio Incubator with the registration details, etc. So you can respond to the same email. We'll collect all the queries and try to have them answered offline by Mr. Sankla and Mr. Sheth. Once again, thank you so much, and thank you so much, Satin sir, for helping me in organizing this extremely needed session.
Thank you, Aditi, and once again, thanks to Ajay and Bhavesh. Very special thanks. You know the reason, because there was little, Ajay knows that. So extremely special thanks and all the best to you, Bhavesh. And yeah, we'll collect all the questions, some of them which I could answer. Otherwise, I think Ajay will be there to help. So we won't have anyone going disappointed. I know it's a
Yep.
short session and they are also busy with their own work. So we'll collect, and as far as possible, we'll answer all the questions. So don't be disheartened about this. So we'll do that. And wonderful evening, Bhavesh and Ajay. Thank you. Ajay, you
Yeah.
would like to say
Thank-
anything?
Yeah, thank you, sir, and thank you for giving this opportunity to actually talk about US FDA. And I'd like to inform all the participant, Aditi, MDS, sir, and I was discussing about like what do we do next, like to help medical equipment manufacturers in India. So there is a thought going on right now that we may be presenting on 60601, like what 60601 standard is. So we'll update you when we are going to arrange that modular seminar or webinar. Like it will be a multiple sessions of those standards. So we'll let you know, we'll update you. Aditi will keep you posted on that. We are planning to have maybe 1 or 2 hour sessions, for a few weeks so that our manufacturers in India will be able to get some help from those presentation, because we'll be talking clause by clause on 60601 so that our people in India can get more help. And we do have a lot of labs where you guys can go and get the product tested, and we'll give you all those information. And just tune in for that.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a
Yeah.
Thank
good
you.
Our pleasure, and thanks for having us. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Have a nice
Okay.
evening.
Bye.
evening.